Hello and welcome to today's BIC Streams, a decent living standard for everyone lifts all. Those of you who are here for the first time, you can go to our website and sign up to our mailing list to keep track of our programs. There could not be a better time than now during the coronavirus pandemic to look at the very visible disparity that exists in our country. Hello and welcome to today's... The instructions, stay home and keep social distance, wash hands frequently, mean very different things depending on who you are and how much you earn. This deepening disparity is also reflected in our energy access and use. Even as India's electricity generation capacity has tripled over the past decade, the urban affluent live on par with anyone in Western countries. Over 300 million people, including those in our rich cities, don't have access to electricity in their homes, and another 300 million get it for just a few hours a day. India's party to the global commitment to reduce carbon emissions by 2030. So how do we do it along with raising living standards for most Indians? How does a country like ours sustain the well-being of its affluent while making ecological space for the poor to improve their lives? Here to present us some answers to these important questions through his research, Decent Living Energy and the Climate of Inequality, is Narasimha Rao. Welcome. He will be in conversation with Sarat Chandra Leele after the presentation, and it will be followed by a Q&A. They will take questions from the attendees after their conversation. There is a chat box that you can see below on your screen. You can find their bios there, and we will also use that chat box to communicate with the attendees. You can type in your questions into the Q&A box. If any of you has any difficulty with typing your questions, you can raise your hands and we will try and get through to you to ask your question. Welcome, and over to you, Narasimha.
Okay, good evening, everyone in India. Thank you so much for joining this session. Thank you very much to the Bangalore International Center for hosting this event. I was actually supposed to be in Bangalore almost a month ago to have this in person. It would have been so much nicer to have met all of you in person and had that interaction. But we're all coming to terms with the surreal state of affairs we are in right now. So as we all worry and think about COVID and how we deal with the lockdowns and will we get away with this with a minimal loss of life, many of us, including myself, are thinking about, well, what's the world going to look like after COVID? Yeah? And let's not forget that we actually have been in the midst of a global crisis already. Also one with imminent threats posed to the life and livelihoods of millions of people across the world. Also one where if we delay action, we can face exponential damages. And of course, I'm talking about climate change, which is occurring at a much slower time scale. But we are still thinking a lot about what lessons can we learn for climate change and dealing with that crisis from the experiences we have in COVID. And there are many lessons to learn, some sobering, but I do think there are some positive lessons as well. There is maybe a silver lining. I will get to that at the end of this presentation. But what I want to focus on is primarily a striking parallel that I see, and that has to do with inequality. Namely, the response, our response to these crises has led to people being put at risk who are the most vulnerable in our society, and in some sense who have contributed the least to the escalation of these crises. And we're seeing that in COVID around the world. In the US, we've seen it also in India. The plight of the migrant workers has made international headlines. But it's not just India. The UN has made clear that this is a crisis that could not only devastate economies, but could potentially ramp up inequality. In the case of climate change, there's some similarities in the sense that we have the Paris Agreement, which is great. The goal is to restrict temperature change globally to well within 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial times. But the notion of equity, the fairness and how we distribute the burden of actually responding to this crisis has virtually disappeared from the discourse. And the countries essentially submit pledges to do whatever they can to reduce emissions. But if we are to actually take these goals seriously, we have to revisit the idea of equity. That's something I believe. And why is this? Well, the reason is that the goals of the Paris Agreement require that global emissions go down to zero between 2050 and 2070. That's literally net zero. What that means is we have to make a significant turnaround in our emissions trajectory. And this creates a limited carbon budget, finite amount of emissions that we can put up into the atmosphere for the rest of the century. And that presents a zero-sum game. What is the implication of that? Well, we have 2.5 billion people in OECD countries and China that have grown and developed on the backs of cheap energy that continue to grow, albeit at a slower pace. And then we have about 4.5 billion people across the world in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America that have to leapfrog and transform into this low carbon society at a fraction of the income of these OECD countries. And that's kind of the cries of justice that have been emanating from developing countries for a couple of decades now about responses to climate change in international negotiations. But that's not the only part of the story. We've seen significant technological advances where the cost of renewable energy has plummeted. The cost of electricity from solar energy today in many parts of the world, including some parts of India in some cases, is competitive with fossil fuel-based electricity. Furthermore, we don't actually need emissions, right? What we need is energy and land, the transformation of which generates greenhouse gases. And there are many opportunities for us to use energy in a much more efficient way than we do today. And a couple of classic examples is public transportation is significantly more efficient, but has many, many health benefits. It reduces congestion, air pollution. Another example is China's reduction in the use of coal power, primarily for health reasons because of the air pollution, not for climate change. So it is really not clear how much of this carbon budget we need for human development. How much energy do we need for human development? There's an uncertainty, particularly about what I call the climate-friendly development strategies. And part of the reason for this uncertainty, we've been trying to answer this question for over 20 years, pretty unsuccessfully, is what do we mean by development in the first place? And conventional mainstream thinking, GDP is the main metric that we think about in terms of development. And we see the trajectory of countries in the past. It shows a pretty clear picture that there's a relentless increase in energy use as GDP increases. And so if we look at the energy consumption of many parts of the world, and perhaps you can just get a sense of these numbers, I might be referring to them later, this would imply that poor countries have to increase their energy use by an order of magnitude to get up to the level of industrialized countries. And the question is that what we mean by development? But there's a lot of research showing that GDP is not a great indicator of human well-being. Certainly at high income levels, there's a lot of research showing that happiness and well-being are not correlated to GDP. But even at lower income levels, a lot of social indicators don't correlate well with GDP. Let's take the example of Bangladesh versus India. India's GDP has now at this point more than double that of Bangladesh, having been comparable at independence time. But Bangladesh has a higher level of female literacy, lower infant mortality, and much lower income inequality. So it's not really clear that that is the right indicator for us to think about, particularly when you think about the material requirements for well-being, which is what we need to consider for energy use. And it's quite clear that at high levels of income, a lot of material use really does not necessarily contribute to people's well-being. Even at the basic income level for households, we might consider that growth is, of course, important, but is not necessarily an end. It is a means to an end. And we still need to think about what is that reference end that we need to measure our well-being against. A picture often says 1,000 words. This is a photograph I took of a slum in Mumbai. And Clearly, these are living conditions that are not ideal. People are living in overcrowded spaces, unhygienic conditions, lack of sanitation, improper water supply, and all of these are certainly not decent living conditions. But nevertheless, you have most of these slums having satellite dishes and televisions, and in fact, some having air conditioners. Yeah, only 10% of Indians have air conditioning. So really, income is not necessarily a good indicator of living conditions. So what is a decent living standard? How should we define it? And I'm particularly interested in the material basis, the material minimum, because that's what translates to energy use. Of course, political rights and social rights, psychological well-being, these are all extremely important for a good life, but they don't necessarily translate to material requirements. So we have looked at the literature on philosophy and social policy and looked at standards for health and other factors across the world to come up with what we consider a basket for what is a universal, inviolable minimum standard for the material requirements for a decent life. Certainly not sufficient, and also customizable to local conditions because of culture and climate, etc. So I want to quickly walk through what we put forth as a minimum basket of living standards. And this includes materials at the household level, the community level, and infrastructure to support these services. We categorize them into physical well-being and social well-being. And so to provide good health to people, we need food, but we need not just calories, but we need micronutrients, we need protein. And this has implications for the kinds of diets that are good for people. People need to have clean cook stoves. Millions of people across the world are prematurely killed, especially women and children, due to chulas and solid fuel use. And we need cold storage to preserve food. Health and hygiene involves having adequate supply of water, clean toilets, access to communal washing facilities, and a healthcare system with a minimum amount of resource so that we can have hospitals, health clinics, and qualified staff to provide healthcare services. People need to live in durable and safe homes that protect them against the elements with a minimum amount of space, we argue, to prevent overcrowding. Some lighting, that means access to electricity. And here's something important and provocative. We argue that people may need air conditioning as a basic need in order to keep temperatures within 26 degrees Celsius in summer and not less than 20 degrees in winter, and with a reasonable amount of humidity because it affects health and productivity. And so we argue that there may be need for air conditioning as well. Social well-being is equally important, and we see this as in the minimum people having a certain amount of education and an educational system nationwide, as well as people having in a modern society access to means of social engagement, that is, having access to some form of broadcast media to learn about the world and be informed, and of course, communication devices to connect to people. Social affiliation is an extremely important dimension of well-being. And very importantly, people need access to transport, motorized transport, we argue, because that extends the radius of your life. And it could be public transport. We certainly not think that everybody needs to have a car at their disposal. So we take this entire basket together and we've matched that against the number of people that are below the World Bank's $1 a day. And in India's case, you'll see the gaps in these different dimensions are significantly higher than the number of people that lack the $2 a day income level. With income growth by 2030, we expect that some of these deprivations will go away. So everybody is likely to have a television and fridge, as you see the difference between the blue line and the red line. But many of these deprivations will remain in 2030. And this already should give you a sense that the energy demand that we have and the growth that we have today is not really serving these living standards because we have all these gaps. Okay, so then I'm going to fast forward 2 years of work with a lot of number crunching to calculate the energy needs for providing these basic standards. And what's most important to communicate here is that we consider comprehensively the energy requirements across the economy for meeting these different living standards. So for example, the energy required to provide cooling is not just the electricity you use for running your air conditioner, it's the energy used to manufacture the air conditioner, to manufacture the inputs to manufacture the air conditioner, and so on and so forth. So it's a completely comprehensive view of energy requirements in a country. And the first thing we need to do is we need to build out infrastructure. And we consider two scenarios. One is just business as usual, and the other is taking into account some of these, what I call the climate-friendly development strategies. I want you to focus not on the numbers right now, but just the composition. And what you see is that the public transport is really the primary contributor to the energy required in this initial capital investment to grow the infrastructure. But when we impose a restriction that all future demand in urban areas would be primarily public transit, that is a lot fewer personal vehicles, the energy we need to provide the same standard is significantly less, because public transit is just so much more energy efficient. And that's with housing, rural and urban housing. We consider about 50 million units that would need to be built. If we use efficient practices based on local materials, we could also reduce the energy use significantly. If we consider the delivery of these living standards, again, we find that transport fuels are the bulk of the energy requirements. But we also have food as an important dimension here. And this is food for production, the production energy for food, as well as the energy used to prepare food. Here we don't see a big difference in terms of reducing energy requirements for foods in a sustainable scenario. But I should point out that there's a lot of non-energy related emissions from the food sector. And I've done previous work, including presented in Bangalore, showing that diets in India are very rice dominant, especially amongst the poor, that generate a lot of methane emissions. And if we move to alternate grains that we used to eat in the past, like millets and jowar, we would improve nutrition and reduce impacts on climate change. So what's important in this picture actually is what's absent here. Some of the most important services we provide: water, sanitation, basic education, even space cooling, even air conditioning at a very minimal level. And I should point out, we really only consider cooling bedrooms at night and in this minimum space. It's almost a trivial amount of energy, and that may be surprising to you. Let's consider now what the overall effect is of the total energy requirements. What we find is 12 to 15 gigajoules would be sufficient to provide these decent living standards in India, keeping in mind that that is well below the total amount of energy, which is presently 20 gigajoules. And current times where we have these gaps in decent living, less than half the energy that we currently use goes to meeting these basic living standards. And so the difference between these two trajectories, this is the national trajectory of total energy demand. It's only one example of a very conservative growth scenario. The difference between these two, I would call, is affluence, is energy associated with growing affluence. If we consider scenarios where we actually have to squeeze our energy growth even further in a hypothetical 2 degrees C world, this puts even more tension between providing basic living standards and increasing affluence within India. So we see clearly here there's an equity issue within the country, a tension between raising basic living standards and growing affluence. And it turns out, when we look at other countries as well, we've studied this problem and estimated these requirements for other developing countries. Brazil is one country where we find for the same standard, you would need about double the energy that India needs. And it's probably a good question to ask in the Q&A as to why that is the case. So we think for most countries in the world, we would need less than 25 gigajoules per capita to provide these living standards. So what that implies, going back to our GDP growth-based energy growth pattern, is that all of this energy really would be associated with growing living standards above this basic minimum, affluence. And this has much significance, because what this is implying is that raising people out of poverty, millions of people out of poverty, is not really a threat to climate change. When we go back to this idea of a zero sum in mitigating climate change, it's not exactly a zero sum game between rich countries and poor countries. It's not exactly between haves and have-nots either. Really, it's a zero sum game in the pursuit of relative affluence among people in all countries of the world. So really, if we were to redirect our attention, our policies, our resources towards raising people's living standards, towards those basic services that are not energy intensive but important for human development, if we were to push for public transportation as opposed to a car infrastructure, we would very likely, in a more equitable society, contribute greater to well-being while reducing emissions. In other words, a more equitable society may be one with fewer overall emissions. Of course, the question is, are the affluent going to be willing to move in that direction? And that brings me back to COVID, because in a post-COVID world, we've been forced into the social experiment that I don't think we would have been willing to undertake had this not happened, right? Here we are sitting completely stalled, got off the treadmill of our lives, get to reflect on what's important to us. We're not traveling anymore. We're telecommuting, not flying to conferences, thinking potentially about what matters to us most. And perhaps we can hold on to some of these changes in lifestyle after this crisis, because we may find out that some of these changes are actually beneficial to our well-being. And so that's the hope that I have, that some of these changes can actually lead to less material consumption among the affluent while not reducing their well-being, thereby freeing up this space, this carbon space, for raising basic living standards. So I'm going to stop at that. Again, thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to the questions that you have, especially Sharad, and I turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Narasimha. I would certainly wish that we had this session in live in person at the BIC. I'm sure you would have received a really warm round of applause for a very succinct and clear presentation on a very important topic. And also the link with COVID-19 is a very interesting one that you brought in back at the end. So let me actually start from there, which I'm sure you've been thinking about also in more detail. And it ties to the sentence before this last link about COVID-19. You said something to the effect that a more equitable country or society may also have less carbon emissions, for instance. And before that, you said that the zero-sum game is really not between the poor in the world and the rich in the world. It's really between the affluent, different affluent people who are really pushing that envelope upwards, whereas you really need a very small amount for the bottom, decent living conditions for the bottom. So linking that affluence question back to COVID-19, it seemed, as you said, that COVID is providing us an opportunity to reflect on our lifestyles, our consumption patterns. A lot of the people that I've been talking to informally have said, actually for 3 weeks without a shopping spree in the shopping mall, or without going out to the latest restaurant and for an evening dinner right across town, driving 20 kilometers, it's not really that big a deal, right? To have this reduced lifestyle. And is this something that so a lot of people have been thinking about, is this therefore something we can hang on to and promote and so on? So I guess my question therefore is the focus on decent living standards, or maybe your next enterprise could be the focus on the indecent living standards of the affluent, right? Because the problem really lies with their lifestyles, and how do we cut back those standards, or at least the associated emissions with the standards, so that we can create that space, whether it's a carbon space, whether it's a local environmental space. So would you have thoughts on sort of the relative importance of these two dimensions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for actually very nicely pulling out the key takeaways from my presentation. Yeah, so I think we are now in the process of calculating these energy requirements for industrialized countries as well. There are some differences. For example, heating, right? People in cold countries need to heat, which we don't see much of in my calculations. However, from what the preliminary work we've done, heating is not going to be more than 1 gigajoule per capita. Okay, so you're not adding much actually with respect to that. I suspect that we won't be much higher than this band, 15 to 30 gigajoules, even in the industrialized economies, to to define this basic minimum standard. Of course, the problem is that in industrialized countries, you have a built infrastructure, right? And undoing that is difficult. If you imagine buildings, retrofitting buildings to the extent of energy efficiency improvement that is feasible is very difficult. And of course, people are creatures of habit. So there's a lot of political opposition to making any of these changes, and not necessarily by many, right? We know how these societies' decisions are made. But that's why this COVID crisis is interesting, because we've been literally forced by fiat into this situation that we never would have agreed to. And I'm thinking mainly of people like myself, right? I've been trying to, in my own personal space and climate researchers, it's interesting that climate researchers fly more than the average business travelers. And they feel, I don't know, that they're justified in doing so by what they do. And now the entire climate research community is sitting at home and working. And I genuinely feel that this can be a permanent change. Certainly lead to reduced travel. Like you said, I think there's many changes people may learn that are not going to affect them so much. The other dimension to it is, we are seeing this problem as a global problem the whole time. In the news, we're constantly seeing the developments in other countries. And that sensitization to the global nature of the problem, I felt, was lacking with climate change. Most of the discourse we see in industrialized countries it tries to actually push away the equity issue, and just see it as, for example, aggregate emissions from India and China, right, without taking into account the per capita income. So yeah, I do see hope a little bit from that. I do plan to, in fact, do more research, like a social experiment, looking back and asking people about their experiences in the few months under the COVID lockdown, and maybe we can learn where we can make some gains. There are some threats as well, but I'll get to that later.
Great. So now to dig a little bit deeper into what you presented on the DLS idea, I had a couple of questions. So you had this graph, the vehicle graph that you showed, where you showed that under current conditions, since vehicular investments are primarily in private vehicles, private passenger cars, you've got a huge amount of energy that's going into the creation of that stock, and then obviously that will also translate into higher operational emissions. Whereas if you were to invest in public transport, you would get a very different picture, right? So sort of linking that to your last point about the opposition to change, it seemed to me that it's not just a graph about different trajectories or different amounts of emission or different amounts of energy embedded in that particular technology, let's say private car versus public transport, but also for whom, technology for whom, right? Those graphs are representing the consumption behavior of different classes of society. And so I guess the question is, how do you get, it seemed to me almost that while one side of the question is, how do you get decent transport for the poor, and they don't have to be crushed in Bombay locals to the same extent or be falling off while they're hanging from, by the skin of their teeth. It seems like the bigger question is, how do you get the affluent again out of their cars into those sustainable transport solutions? So what is your take on, again, this dichotomy or this challenge?
This is a difficult one, because now you're talking about more practical issues of implementation and the distribution of these living standards, right? And I mean, my analysis doesn't go there. I mean, this is really just looking at what could be from a more material perspective. And just to clarify, in both scenarios, we are looking at the entire mix of modes of transport. It's just that there's a relative importance on public transport and the sustainable trajectory. But yes, people giving up this private cars, and they have so much embedded infrastructure, it's very difficult to undo. There's also a threat from COVID that I wanted to point out, that people may be less interested or maybe scared to use public transport because of the social distancing. And that's my biggest concern, actually. But we've seen from the Delhi metro example that people from different income classes use it. And in other parts of the world, all classes of income use all the public transport. You've seen that in Europe, you see it in Latin America. So I think it is possible if you create, especially with the road infrastructure, because you can't undo the road infrastructure, but you can have dedicated bus lanes. And if you make them comfortable and spacious, I think with connectivity, you can have broader range of income classes actually using public transport. I mean, you're not going to get the entire society to shift over. Even in Europe, actually, car transport is a very high share. So it may surprise people, but at least we can move in that direction a lot more than we are now.
So again, drilling a little deeper, I was just wondering on this issue of DLS. So you've given a projection of what is the energy cost of achieving a decent living standard, and presumably you can translate that into emissions,
Right.
carbon emissions, based upon assumptions about the technology and so on, right?
Right.
What is the economic cost? So what would it? You made a very interesting point in the beginning about how if you define some kind of a decent living standard, the number of people who are deprived of a decent living standard in India, for instance, or globally perhaps also, is much higher than the number of people who are defined as poor using the $1.50 per day or $2 per day definition of poor, right?
Right.
Because there is a difference between absolute sort of poverty and a decent living standard, right? So the question that immediately struck me was, what would it require in terms of dollars per day for somebody to be able to actually afford that decent living standard? Do you have any?
I actually, this is a great question. It's the next place we have to go with this, because this is actually a common effort in many countries that determine the minimum wages, for example, right? They think about a reference basket of goods and then they price it out. So in the UK, they have a reference budget and they use that to come up with the living wage. In the US, they have efforts to come up with a living wage on the same basis. So these are very, very dependent on domestic policies, right? I mean, what something costs is really a function of policy. And government can choose to subsidize something, right? So on the one hand, we don't know how expensive it will be, but I think a lot of this is going to be a redistribution of national expenditure, and a lot of it will involve not just personal expenditure, because many of these services are provided, as a common infrastructure, right? Whether it's public transport or water and sanitation. So this is really a matter of policy priority and reprioritizing government budgets, right? This is quite fundamental, and it could be, how it translates into people's bottom line really depends upon, again, policies. So yeah, we don't know exactly what this will cost, but I wouldn't say that is a fundamental barrier. There's enough money to go around, even just like you have such a small share of energy in the world today that's required. I suspect a similar amount of money would be enough to provide these services compared to the total amount of income.
So that goes back to the first point about well-being versus GDP. It just seemed to me that you're saying also it's not really the first of all. So it seemed like you were making at least 2 points there, if not more. One, that our whole definition of well-being needs to be questioned, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit more, and whether you had tried to use other definitions of well-being in place of DLS, or a link between DLS and those other forms of well-being. And the second part being that GDP, even if it's a means to an end, or income is a means to an end, it's misleading for a variety of other reasons, such as the whole equity issue. That GDP per capita, or the growth in GDP per capita of a country, is not really telling us anything about how equitably the means of accessing well-being are really being distributed. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So there's been a lot of work, since the 90s, actually. Amartya Sen first, brought up the issue of human development not being reflected in GDP, and we had the Human Development Index that the UN took up, and that's being used quite widely as an indicator, the HDI. Life expectancy is a clear alternative indicator of good health and well-being. But there are more. There's a lot of interest in social progress indicators. There are some indicators in Europe. The Dutch, for example, have a living conditions indicator. There's something known as the social progress indicator, which has been applied to countries at large. But these are all not necessarily normative indicators. They're just a collection of different facets of life. And they include things that, social indicators, crime, safety, security, communication, happiness, and a whole range of indicators. The problem is translating these to environmental impacts is very challenging, because what we care about, as I mentioned, is the material basis for well-being. And there is no work really that's able to do that. What people have done is that they've kind of drawn broad correlations between countries' human development index against their energy use, or life expectancy against their energy use. And that gives you also some estimates of what would be necessary if you assume some threshold of HDI or life expectancy. But those tend to give you very high estimates of sort of 50 to 100 gigajoules per capita in order to have a decent life expectancy or HDI. But they are not necessarily capturing necessary requirements. They may be conflating income growth and other variables that are increasing at the same time as life expectancy. So this bottom-up kind of work that I'm doing is the more reliable way to estimate material needs. And like I said, the only indicators I think that are helping directly address energy and environmental impacts are these material indicators, like living conditions indicators. And so there are people working to develop this DLS and use them more broadly. But I do think there's room for improvement, of course, but I do think it's the direction to go in terms of this bottom-up association of different living standards, because then you can make explicit the technologies that are required, the local conditions, that influence the way you provide the services. I think that's the only way we can truly assess environmental impact. And this can be generalized. Right now that we look at energy, we may look at the impacts on water. How much water do you need to provide people with basic living standards, right? How much phosphorus do you need in agriculture? And we can extend this quite significantly.
Mm-hmm. So just a last question, maybe before I open it up to the floor, I sort of coming back a full circle to this idea of, the statement that reducing inequality within and between countries would improve our ability to mitigate climate change. So there's like a bit of a win-win between reduced inequality and addressing climate change mitigation challenges. And I guess the one struggle I had with that statement was that aren't these really orthogonal, in the sense that you could have a very equitable country which is but consuming or emitting at 20 tons of CO2 per capita per year, or you could have a very equitable country at 5 or 3, right? So in that sense, if one is talking about equity, it obviously depends upon where one is aiming that DLS, right, and whether we are bringing people down towards the DLS as much as we are bringing people up towards the same DLS, those who are below. And then obviously, where are we setting the DLS itself? So in a sense, back to this question of what do we do about the indecent living standards? It's more popular to talk about raising the standards of those who are below the DLS. It's much more unpopular to talk about reducing the indecent standards above the DLS, right?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, I think the conventional wisdom might say that you have to maintain a certain level of inequality in society in order to really grow, because it is the surplus at the higher level of the income distribution that you need in order to invest in the poor. That has been an argument, so that the rising tide has to lift all boats. So the only way you go up is by everybody moving up together, and then you kind of blow the carbon budget pretty quickly. So yes, there is that potential in that scenario, but I do feel that considering where we are and the limits you have to growth, I mean, we have some institutional constraints in terms of the rate at which you can transform materials, right? I mean, we have human institutions and we have structural constraints. So if you're going to really focus on bringing up the living standards of the poor, and you do have some constraints on growth, right, then I do think you're talking about a fundamental change in the equity of development, right? And then those changes, as I've shown, can very well lead to reductions in emissions. So I think the answer to your question is that we do have constraints on growth. And within those constraints, if we do redirect our energy, broadly construed, Towards basic living standards, I do believe we will reduce emissions growth. Public transport, as you said, serves more poor people and it consumes less energy, right? Good health and social indicators, education and basic water sanitation is not requiring much energy, but building bigger airports and expressways do create more energy, and they're serving the affluent, right? So I do think there is a distinct trade-off.
Just a small follow-up on that, though. It seemed like the public budget is a zero-sum game, right? In the sense that if a country has a certain budget, it could spend it on building highways, or it could spend it on building, investing in public transport, or flyovers versus public transport, or and so on. But it seems like increasingly these budgets are being expanded through all these ideas of PPP and so on, where it's really private capital that is building the affluent infrastructure, and the state budgets are left to build the infrastructure for the poor. In which case, then so it's not a zero-sum game. The affluent continue to build their own infrastructure. It almost seems like that. I was wondering if you have some thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, now you're getting to the fundamental political problems we have, right? And I claim no expertise in that. My understanding is as good as yours. I do think we would need fundamental political change in order to really implement what I'm claiming we need. And the insights I'm providing is, what can happen actually, that we don't have these structural constraints in terms of how we use energy and how we have environmental impact. That our problems, in fact, are political. They're not resource-based and they're not structural.
Great, thanks. I'm going to open this up to questions, and right now I'm going to look at the Q&A section. I just want to double check whether there are a lot of hands raised, which for people who could not ask questions, but I'm not seeing a whole lot of hands.
There are no hands, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm going to just start with the basic questions you yourself had planted in some sense. So why does actually Brazil need more gigajoules per capita to achieve DLS, just as an example?
Yeah, so the two main reasons. One of them is that Brazil has developed into a complete car-dependent economy. So over 95% of mobility needs in Brazil are met with automobiles. It's an entire road infrastructure, which is significantly less energy efficient than a rail infrastructure or a bus infrastructure. So for the same amount of travel by motorized transport, if we use the current mode shares, Brazil requires double what India requires for the same amount of transport. The second reason is diets. So to provide the same amount of nutrition, we considered cultural factors, and the diet of Brazilians includes a lot more meat, and that is much more energy and greenhouse gas intensive. So this brings up interesting questions of in and of themselves, right? What responsibility do developing countries have for transforming their infrastructure towards mitigating climate change, right? How much should Brazil be responsible for the fact that it has this infrastructure, and how much do you grandfather? That because it's very difficult to undo something from the past. So there is this tension. And I think it needs to be just made explicit. And this analysis makes that explicit. There are those kinds of differences. Some differences are due to geography, right? You need more cooling in areas with very hot and humid weather, whereas in temperate regions, you don't need as much energy for cooling and heating. So that's something you can't do much about. But that variation doesn't seem to be very much, really. Transport is really the big element here.
So could you, just as a quick follow-up on that, would again the issue of grandfathering or special pleading in some sense, just like the temperate countries have tended to say we need more heating energy allowances in some sense. So big countries like Brazil, sort of sparsely populated, the US is also a bit of an example of that, or Canada and Russia are even bigger examples of that. They could say that, well, we are a big country, so to go shopping we need to travel 10 miles, and therefore we need those cars. How does one get around that kind of a...
Well, you may be surprised, but currently 85% of Brazilians live in cities. And, for better or for worse, we expect today half the world lives in cities, and for a mix of reasons that are good and bad, we expect by 2050 that 80% of people across the world will live in cities. And so there is potentially an opportunity from that, because that denser style of living actually enables quite some transformation in how we use transport. And in our buildings, we can build more efficient homes. The high, so I think that's that would be my response. Of course, rural areas, I do think, would need higher energy requirements, because they just, it just is more spread out. But I think we may overestimate the extent of that problem. Also, regarding the heating, people have high heating bills in the US because they have giant homes, and so if you start to tax people for anything above 30, 60 square meters, you keep your home, but then you just pay for it. And those funds can be used for mitigating climate change.
Mm-hmm. So related to this point about grandfathering, and therefore who is responsible, the point you made that should Brazil be held responsible for the fact that it's sitting with all this expensive or more carbon intensive infrastructure, is this a larger question that in the last few slides you had about the emissions trajectory and the room for India to maneuver
Right.
between that emissions trajectory, the safe emissions trajectory, as you called it. And
Right.
I was a little bit curious, and this speaks a little bit to Shweta Srinivasan's question about IPCC integrated modeling assessments, which I will read out in a second. But the prior question to that was, how do why would or where do these safe emissions trajectories, which one could define for the world as a whole, how do they get translated into country level limits? Isn't there a whole political economy there itself?
That's a deep question. I would need a lot of time to discuss this, but the short answer is that most of these models that are trying to describe scenarios for the future, they have to regionalize some of their projections, right? And the way they do it simply is on the basis of cost efficiency. So they have estimates in these models of the differential costs for building power plants in India versus Brazil versus the United States, based on labor cost differences, etc. And most of the time, they're doing a global cost minimization.
Wow.
And
okay.
without considerations of equity. And then in some cases, they do scenarios where they put some constraints, an equity constraint, where they kind of model a financial transfer that would be required, so that you still have those efficiency improvements and advanced technologies in India, but somehow there's magically a financial flow from the developed economies to compensate for the fact that you're constraining them in the extent to which they pay for those changes. So that's usually how they do it. So these kind of squeezed energy trajectories are totally based on cost, and kind of I would take it with a grain of salt almost, because it really does not account for equity. But the point is to bring this out into the open so it can be discussed. So now I think there's a more solid basis to make claims as to what is the kind of arrangements we need, to try and provide technology, in subsidized form, so that they serve our most basic needs, right? And I think that kind of discussion is more productive than one about claims to carbon space in general.
So Shweta's question is, the IPCC integrated modeling assessments indicate that just social behaviors or reducing affluence will not bend the emission trajectories enough for even a 2-degree pathway. They emphasize the role for transformation technologies globally based on annual non-LCA estimates. I don't quite know the jargon, but maybe you do. Based on this analysis, is there a case for pushing for consumption-based inventories and abatement strategies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that most of the scenarios that you see in these models have a particular paradigm within which they're modeling change, right? And that's kind of more of a mainstream paradigm of GDP-based growth with significant improvements in efficiencies of technologies. So it's very technology-focused assessment of change, and even behavioral change, in terms of shared transport use. I think that there's one scenario, a paper that actually I was a part of, where we looked at a demand side scenario. It's the only one where we envisioned what will society look like if you really transformed how much energy do we demand to be a lot less. It's still quite technology focused, but it could be interpreted also as a significant lifestyle change. I mean, just imagine if we claim that in the future you'll need only half the number of cars we have today.
Wow.
Because
Okay.
we don't believe in owning cars anymore. We see mobility as a service, and we have smartphones and technology that we can schedule our travel and always have some car available to us, in the shared economy. That's an example of a significant lifestyle change that drastically reduces energy use. That is in one integrated assessment model exercise, just one.
Okay, great. There was a question more generally about just 1 second. Yeah, so I think the going back to the issue of the income required to get to DLS or to meet the DLS requirements. The question is, if the affluent reduce consumption to a sustainable level, what happens to jobs that have so far produced things that affluent use, for example, private cars and tourism? And one might even add, in theory, provide some amount of trickle down benefits for the poor, which otherwise would not be there.
That's also a wonderful question. You would have noticed that this entire analysis is sort of on the consumption side, right? We're talking about what people need to consume. Livelihood is critical, right? And I think the question one might ask, which is also something that's scope for further research, is if you were to have an economy where people were thinking of this decent living standard as a sufficiency threshold, right? We do have the tools to figure out the employments that you would need to support just that level of service, and to figure out if we can employ everybody, right? And I do think that, again, this is not based on rigorous analysis, it's my sort of judgment, is if you consider the amount of productive capacity we have already in society, technological capacity, there is a possibility that you have a lot more people change in their level of livelihoods, that they engage more in other services, not necessarily manufacturing. But I do think there is the possibility for employment in new areas that might be more rewarding than the current state of the world. But it needs to be analyzed. I can't say for sure how many people would need to be employed to provide DLS. It is a great question that still needs to be answered.
And would that be tied to the structure of the economy, in the sense of, how if let us say I actually aim, I'm obviously sitting above that DLS threshold as a middle class, upper middle class, even in the Indian context, upper middle class person, I'm sitting much above that threshold. So if I decide that, well, I really want to actually go down towards that threshold, that reduces my income need in some sense. I don't need the same amount of income to live at that lower threshold, or even halfway towards there, right? But if I continue to think of that surplus income of mine as a source of, again, more income, that is, as a capitalist, my job is to then invest my savings to get returns, then we may not ever get out of that loop, because I'm still basically using my surplus income not to share, but to generate more income, as dividend on my savings or something. Do you think that's part of the problem?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the naive idealist in me will say that, if there's enough people who push for these kinds of changes, we have policies that have progressive taxation, and you can provide a universal basic income that kind of obviates the need to worry about people's jobs, really, because they have a certain cushion. And so, it could be even if you don't want to give it up, you are taxed, and you accept it because you get other benefits from being in that society.
So that related to that is this question from Amani. Could you talk about how environmental movements can use this knowledge to advocate for equitable environmental policies and create a more broad-based coalition for climate justice? What are your thoughts on market-based mechanisms to protect the environment, what activists call false solutions like carbon trading?
Well, thank you for that question, actually. I mean, my goal is to try and provide the results of this research to the broader community for NGOs and groups to take up, to make more kind of specific arguments about the kinds of changes that ought to be instituted. And so, I think there's some concrete recommendations that can flow out of this work. That's, I think, hopefully useful for NGOs to take up. Of course, access to some of these academic papers is important, and it's not open access. That's a big problem. But I can make it available to anybody who writes me an email. And on the market-based mechanisms, I'm not so sure necessarily that these are all bad. I think in some sense, these are different instruments with the same purpose. If you have the political change such that you want to institute, a significant carbon penalty, it can be done in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that a carbon tax is in the current political environment ends up being too benign. But that's not a problem with the instrument. That's the problem with the politics that doesn't want an ambitious tax. I do think I'm not so concerned about the market-based instruments as being a problem as such.
I see. But you would make a distinction between market-based as in taxation, carbon taxes, versus market-based as in carbon trading regimes. Yeah.
Again, that's a very big discussion. That's very country dependent. Really, I couldn't say something that's universal about it. Nobody likes taxes, but there's mechanisms in cap and trade that can completely take the air out of the efficacy of a carbon instrument as well. So I think of it as 6 of one, half dozen of another, really.
Two interesting questions sort of linking this back to COVID. One of them from Srinivasan Sudarshanam. With many nations becoming insular and protective, and given that the movement to more sustainable lifestyles requires new technologies, how realistic is it for developed nations to aspire to give, to get, I think he meant developing nations, to get relevant technology transfers? That may be a big showstopper, other than associated investments and mindset changes in the consuming population. So I guess this question of insularity, whether COVID leads to more insularity and therefore more protectionism and less technology transfer, is an interesting one. And sort of the related question was about what do you see as the potential for the current sort of COVID-forced behavioral change becoming permanent once the crisis has passed? Are there any examples at all that one could point to? And of course,
on the second question, that's still that work that has to be done. I am hopeful, but really, we're right in the middle of it. We can't say. On the first point about insularity, I'm not convinced that would be the outcome. I think economic factors might trump, this newfound fear. People forget very easily as well, and the significant benefits. I don't know if we can undo the globalized manufacturing setup we have today. And frankly, if actually it does end up moving the direction of buying local, that's actually good for sustainability in many ways. If economies really move towards consuming only what they can get in the right season in their own country, we will actually do much better in terms of resource use. So either which way, if we stay in the globalized economy, if we get more insular, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think the bigger concern is the personal insularity. People's personal behavior in terms of, like I said, public transport, prejudices are coming out as well at a time like this. And that's, to me, a little bit more dangerous.
Yeah, I'm just checking with the organizers how much more time we have before I go on to a few more questions. Jenny or Ravi, can you give me some hints about time?
We have some time. We can take the questions.
Okay, great. We still have several questions open, actually tons of them. We've just barely scratched the surface in some sense. And I'm having a hard time keeping track of the questions as they're pouring in. Narasimha and the audience, I beg your apologies in advance. So I think we've answered this question about insular nations. So Lekha Naidu has a question about, I think from Shloka Nath. Could you speak a little on the perspective of Indian stakeholders on the current status of international climate work in the context of now delayed COP26? I'm not sure how this directly relates to the DLS work, but I'm sure there is a link.
I really can't speak to that. Honestly, I'm not really sure or up to date on what the, if you're asking specifically about the, at the negotiating level. But I have received interest from some policymakers on this idea. There are policymakers that are interested in knowing, kind of in their back pocket, what are the requirements, for meeting these basic living standards. At this point, like I said, the negotiations on equity have pretty much disappeared. And, whether they are in the back rooms continuing, whether they will resume now that we have to actually make new commitments that are really critical right now, and people will be judging the ambition of new commitments. But I think in there, the focus is really on the industrialized countries making more ambitious commitments. I'm not aware of what India would do, but what I would say is that we could use this as a basis to make the point that that we really need action on the part of the developed countries to ramp up ambition. But it also points back our fingers to our own countries that we need to distribute our resources equitably to make that argument really have any force.
Mm-hmm. So just to sort of follow up on that a little bit, if you were a negotiator in the Indian, sort of a part of the Indian team of negotiators at the next COP, I mean, in Paris, we've already made certain commitments, as you said, abandoning the earlier pressure to bring about an equitable allocation of the carbon space or any of that kind of stuff. We sort of made some, nationally determined commitments in some sense. In the next round of negotiations, how would one use the DLS work? Would it be essentially to argue that, well, if we do not ramp up our commitments fast enough, because we need to meet the sort of DLS requirements? Is that how you think they would use it, or is there some other?
This is something I'm currently thinking about, actually, and one of the things I would want to do is and the new language now is of comparable efforts, fair efforts towards mitigating climate change. It's not anymore about this, budget that we want to allocate. It's not anymore about a distribution of a budget. It's about what's a reasonable effort. And I think here, this transparency in terms of what services are really serving your basic needs, so we can say these are the most justified services. To what extent are we allowing for differential levels of affluence if we were to even focus all our efforts on providing basic living standards? What headroom does that leave? And why should Brazil, have that grandfathering versus India? That's the debate that can be started with this kind of information. And so I think we can more concretely speak to where you need to have technology transfer, where you need to have more domestic effort in order to make sort of at least not abstract, but very concrete comparisons about efforts. And I think there's also room to develop some new metrics of these efforts. And I'm working on some of those metrics, in terms of what's the true cost of mitigation in your country, given the fact that solar is cheaper, given the fact that you can improve the energy efficiency of transportation. We can sort of come up with more analysis to come up with what is the true cost of mitigation. And so I'm trying to work in that direction with this new research.
And that would be focused more on the global north. I mean, in terms of looking at true cost, because they are the ones who have been constantly saying that mitigation is too expensive, right?
Yeah, I would think this would need to be done by all countries, really, because I do think there's a lot that we can do in India too. It's not going to amount to as much, but I do think it's important because we are a billion plus people. So what we do and what we lock in matters a lot. So yeah, I think all countries need to undertake this kind of analysis.
There's a sort of coming a little bit more local, maybe, or more specific. There's a question about, given that cities are more efficient, and I think this ties to your question, your answer about Brazil, and the fact that a very large fraction of the Brazilian population lives in cities. Cities are a more efficient way to deliver services to people. Tall residential buildings are a more optimal utilization of space. But where does the balance break between efficiency and beauty or mental health? Is there an optimal population density that is taken into consideration in your models?
Well, nobody takes into account, social and psychological factors and impacts in some of this work, right? It tends to be very material based. And I do think that is a deficiency. I mean, there is a desire to try and incorporate more of sociology and social theories of what does it imply in terms of our community, right? In terms of how we're living as a community when we talk about the related space and how we develop that space. There definitely is a relationship between those two. And we just are not there yet to be able to say anything about that. I do think we're seeing some examples. Like I said, it tends to be more in the context of mobility and in terms of individual needs for space heating. But in terms of what does it require in terms of social interaction, that's a gap I would love to fill myself, actually. But it's a great question. But I don't think the research is anywhere close to being able to address those issues, you know. But there is a lot of work on urban form, yeah, and shared spaces, on green spaces, and creating car-free zones to allow for community, gatherings. So there is that link that has been recognized, but it's very much in its infancy, that research.
I was also wondering, and this sort of speaks to a few of the questions that are out there about city planning. I was wondering to what extent this belief of even the, let's say, the sustainable city planning community about denser cities, high rise being a more efficient use of land, probably some level of efficiency of energy and so on, is framed within a carbon-based economy. So it's still basically about the so I think it's still basically assuming that the whole economy is carbon based, so we can import our food from long distances, and then within that framework, sort of the consumption side of city living, commuting and so on, it gets reduced when you have denser configurations. So do you think there's a bit of a framing problem here, that we are not thinking big enough, especially in a country like India, where even after all this, even if you say 60% of the population is rural, or even 50 or 40%, 40% of 1.5 billion, 10 years from now is going to be massive, right? So are we a little bit sort of blinded by taking the existing paradigm for granted, sort of a carbon-based economy?
I do think there's truth to that. We are taking the status quo as it is and thinking about incremental changes based on what we know in other parts of the world. Why is this migration to urban areas happening, right? This is a neglect of rural development. And so if we think about that view of the world, right, where we develop rural areas, give more attention to agrarian folks, perhaps we need to think well beyond just more efficient, denser urban spaces. I do think that is true. We do need broader thinking. But I don't think that takes away from the fact that we can do much better in the cities we have. And that, the cities are going to develop and they're going to grow. Perhaps we can reduce that influx through more attention to rural development. But we have a lot of unbuilt infrastructure in cities. And so it's a good time to still think about better urban forms, more public transit, and more green space, in the smaller cities. In fact, another trend that we've seen is that this urban development in the future, it seems to be coming more and more from smaller cities. It's not just the growth of the Mumbais and LAs and Tokyos. There's more and more smaller cities that are contributing to urban growth. So that's a little bit hopeful, because now you're talking about really unbuilt infrastructure that we can work with and anticipate in some sense.
Great. Going in a slightly different direction, but coming back, I think related to this idea of building cities with more of a community feel and so on, is, I think the person who actually raised the question is Sylvia Mason. She's saying standing in the way of DLS in India, apart from political barriers, is also social systems like caste. Can we ever think of equity or sufficiency in these circumstances?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, this is another political problem, right? And we have to overcome those. We have to care enough to want to provide these services. I mean, this view of mine is a very material view. I don't claim that this is at all implementable, politically feasible. But from the perspective of a resource view, I just think it is eminently feasible. And I would love for others to weigh in on how we overcome those problems.
Saraj, if I can come in at this point, we have Sivakumar, who has been given talking permission to ask us questions. Sivakumar, can you go ahead with your question, please?
Yeah, definitely. So my question is actually related to the rural development. These migrant workers, now they have gone back to their home, but many of the jobs are related to the export, construction, everything, and it may take a long time to come back. So until then, is it not the government have a role to invite investors and do something in the rural areas, or maybe an agro-based development with a cooperative kind of approach, raising some bond investments kind of thing?
Yeah, I do think. I mean, this is very much a domestic issue within India of prioritizing the needs of the migrant workers and of rural areas. I'm trying to think of what perspective I would offer to this question. I mean, we need to give more attention to, I think, what rural needs are. I think perhaps there's a potential, implicit bias in terms of understanding how modern society works, which is largely more urban, and look at rural societies that are more agrarian. Perhaps they have different needs. And so what I mean, just from my perspective, it's only tangentially addressing your question. I would suggest that we have much more focus groups and more local participation to ask people, given this understanding of human well-being, what in your context, what do you want as your basic living standard? I think people who are working on poverty are thinking a lot about doing focus groups to get people's own participation to understand what their needs are. And in that context, I would say for rural areas, we need more of that. I don't know what else to say with regards to your, the question of the immediate crisis.
If I could just add to that, Narasimha, I thought just a
Please.
Small addition to that. So I think apart from the rural consumption question, there's a rural production question, which is
Right.
that if people have gone home back now because of COVID, one should ask why were they in the city in the first place? It's because they didn't have
Right.
productive livelihoods or adequately productive livelihoods in their villages. And that raises the question, is that inevitable? Is it always the case? Yes, in a carbon-based economy, we always visualize people moving off agriculture and becoming part of industry and so on and so forth. Because in the industry, the labor force is adding on to what is essentially a petroleum-driven process. And if you now trying to tweak that or move away from that, in that whole process, we can ask the question, what is the employment potential / productive potential of rural areas? And has it been adequately explored, or has it been neglected because we thought that industrialization was the way to go? And we've been underpricing a lot of rural products in some sense. So I think my answer to this question would be that rather than think about what is the sort of a stopgap arrangement or when they come back next, what do we do? I think the question we should be asking is how do we retain a big slice of that labor force in rural areas in more productive livelihoods? And some of the work that we are doing on forest rights, for example, in Maharashtra and other parts of central India, where if you just change the nature of rights over natural resources like forests, the kind of increases that you see in incomes, because it was essentially the state and private contractors, taking away large part of the surplus. That surplus now goes back into the hands of the rural poor. So I think that additional possibility that there are actually not necessarily nature-based, not necessarily purely agrarian, but some mixed livelihoods in rural areas that can be made much more viable than they have been, because we were only focused on large industries, closer to cities, employing a whole bunch of daily wagers or whatever. So I think that could be an additional way of addressing this question. There is
I think we can take one more question and then closing thoughts.
Okay, so in terms of fairness, is there any other sort of hands up for an oral query?
No, there's no other. Yeah, that was the only question.
So I think in the related question of trickle down, I think several people have asked questions which are about what happens to the economy in the context of, let's say, the affluent reducing their consumption, to a DLS level? How do we or a post-COVID sort of 19, a more practical version of that, which is a post-COVID-19, shrinking of the economy. So the question is, what would happen to our current economic system? The living standards, or really the consumption activities of the affluent also contribute to economic activity. For example, the tourism sector is a driver of a lot of economic activity. You stop that and it impacts jobs and livelihoods. So how does one transition to a new paradigm in those situations where there is a lot of dependence on the consumption of the affluent people?
Yeah, there is this major concern that in the current paradigm, you will have significant economic shocks if you reduce growth. I mean, we are in a paradigm and an economy that is very, very growth dependent and growth driven. And the massive unemployment that we're seeing in the US is because of structural conditions, the absence of a social net. And as soon as you have 1 quarter of low growth, you have massive unemployment. And so that might suggest that you can't afford to have any kind of reduction of affluence or reduction of consumption. But you have to really think bigger and longer term in terms of structural changes that are required, how we value the value added to the society, right? What we place monetary value on, and those kind of fundamental changes, they have occurred in the past, and in fact, sociological studies have shown that they happen best after crises. People are more receptive to these kinds of drastic changes after crises, and you've seen that in the history very often for the worse. People have implemented and instituted changes that have been not broadly equitable, but I think this is therefore an opportunity to transcend the short-term thinking. The world that the COVID is offering that opportunity for us to do that. And I also would say that there have been a lot of such shifts. There were loss of employment when manufacturing shifted to China, right? And there have been cities that have been deserted and new cities emerging. And we've had those transitions. If we can manage those transitions, we can provide people with retraining, alternative employment. It has happened at a slower time scale. It all is a question of social support systems that need to exist in these societies.
So do you think this was the wrong time for Bernie Sanders to pull out of the presidential race?
Well, I don't think he had a choice, unfortunately. He would not have won. It's just he came pretty close. But now we're caught between a rock and a hard place. But
well,
yeah.
Thanks a lot, Narasimha. Really, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And again, if we were in person, I'm sure everybody in the audience would have risen in applause for a very interesting and very insightful session, lecture, as well as your responses to the vast variety of questions that we directed at you. So thanks a lot. And on behalf of the organizers and on my own personal behalf, I'd just like to appreciate your taking the time and the effort to do this.
If I may offer my thanks as well. Thanks so much.
My applause can be heard.
Thank you, Narasimha and Saraj, for a brilliant session. Thank you all for participating.
Thanks very much.
I'll just add one more thing, saying there's still a whole bunch of questions that we couldn't get to them. I hope some of them actually got addressed tangentially or indirectly in the discussion that we had. I'm sure there are many more questions that you can probably direct to Narasimha over email or other ways in which you can pursue them.
I think, Narasimha, would you like to share your the last screen where you had your email if people need to get in touch with you of your presentation?
Sure.
Yeah.
By the way, Sharad, first of all, you did a great job. This is very difficult in real time to do this. And you asked some great questions and your comments were great. So it's great chatting with you. Thanks a lot.
Most welcome.
Yeah, so the screen is up for those of you who would like to make note of the email. Please do, and you can get in touch with Narasimha directly. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Narasimhan, and thank you, Sharad.
Thank you, Jenny.
Bye.
Bye.
And